We are reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the cosmic horse of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And we have come now to the fourth aspect of the unfolding in this first verse. The first we saw was the essential description emerging into manifestation from the unmanifest. In the second, the universal powers by which the manifestation is expressed, made firm, are described with the sun, the wind, and fire, Agni. Time as the self of the horse. And in the third movement, it was the description of the essential aspects that create or sustain and express form in the manifestation. The scope of the manifestation from the heavens through the midworlds to the earth, and then the cyclic movements and rhythms of time, the seasons, the months, days and nights, the expanse of the substance as the stars and the sky. And then we come to the inner description of the body of the horse, which represents, as we saw before, the outermost expression of the manifestation. I read that portion first in English and then we move to Sri Aurobindo's commentary. The strands are the food in his belly, the rivers are his veins, his liver and his lungs are the mountains, herbs and plants are his hairs, the rising is his front and the setting his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him. And for this, Sri Aurobindo's commentary now takes us to the powers of the cosmic horse. In the portion we read last time, briefly Sri Aurobindo described the external-most appearance, the symbols, images which he says are used are of an almost gross materiality. And then the more obviously yogic symbols come. So the gross materiality which we read last time, where the strands of the rivers are imaged as the undigested food in the horse's belly, earth not yet assimilated or of sufficient consistency for the habitual works of life. The rivers distributing the water, that is the lifeblood of earth's activities, are his veins. The mountains, breathing in health for us from the rarer altitudes and supporting by the streams born from them the works of life, are his lungs and liver. Herbs and plants, springing up out of the sap of earth, are the hair covering and clothing his body. All that is clear enough and designedly superficial. But then the Upanishad goes on to speak no longer of superficial circumstances, but of the powers of the horse. But before we proceed with the powers, and this is the lightning and the thunder, we review this last portion which we had dwelt at length last time. We saw how there is a sequence and there is a deeper symbol which can be seen in what would otherwise appear to be very superficial. We saw that the undigested food in the belly has come in through the mouth, and the mouth, remember, open mouth is Agni. And it is that power by which form is created, that will of the divine in action by which form is cast and made stable. But it is also the mouth which is eating up, which is enjoying, which is taking in the form, absorbing it, digesting it, and then throwing it out. So there is the suggestion of a cycle of regeneration in the formation of forms. But at the same time, it is through the mouth that what is taken in goes to the belly, where it is still of this insufficient consistency for the habitual works of life. And then is the description of the veins, and then come the liver and the lungs. And we saw how the sense of the veins which spread, which flow, which carry the lifeblood of all activities, that can be seen on so many levels, including a most gross physical as rivers literally, but also as streams of energy, even at the physical level as electrical, magnetic and other streams of energy, in the subtle worlds as streams of life force and even streams of mental energy. And finally from there the liver and the lungs, which we saw the dual working of taking in, breathing in health for us from rarer altitudes and supporting by the streams born from them the works of life. And this double role is as if assigned to the liver and the lungs. And out of that finally, where the waters have nourished the earth springing up out of the sap of earth are the herbs and plants which form the clothing of the body, the hair, the skin, etc. At this point we could see the result of this flowing energy ending up in the most material outcome, in the most obvious external most appearance as seen on the body of the horse. We have also a deeper perception by which we can see this sequence at a level slightly more abstract. And I want to point to this because all of these are part of the suggestion which is intended. If we observe the sequence in the initial portion, the sun is his eye, the breath is the wind, his wide open mouth is fire. And we would see there the sequence of the elements, the 5 elements, where at first there is the seeing in a subtle expanse by the eye of the truth, the etheric layer, and then the air principle in the breath, and then the fire principle. What is missing though in the sequence is the water principle and the earth principle. And these are precisely what you see here. What the water principle represents and earth principle represents, Sri Aurobindo has elaborated at various places in his essays on the Gita, in the Life Divine, and also in certain other independent articles. But he explains there that out of the etheric principle, where you have only vibration, there is no stable form. The air principle brings contact. The fire principle gives form. And then that form is still unstable. The water principle allows for this coagulation of the form into semi-solid molds. Things are still in a flux, they are still changing, but together they seem to create some kind of stable appearance. And then the dense earth principle is what stabilizes the form and fixes it. And this is what we see in the sequence immediately in the portion we are reading. The strands are the food in his belly, where things of consistency not yet sufficiently stable are held, and they have come straight from the mouth, from the fire principle. And in the stomach, in the digestive process, they are still in this inconsistent state of form. And then immediately is the description of the veins, the rivers as the veins where the flow of the water is imaged. And the liver and the lungs, which we will come back to shortly. But all of this is part of the flow. Even in the liver, even in the lungs, you have this fluid movement. And when that fluid movement reaches its culmination, it becomes from the sap of the earth springing up the herbs and plants, which concretizes in matter finally. So you have this very suggestive sequence of the 5 elements which are following in this description, and this connects very clearly to the initial description of the head of the horse and the sun and the wind and Agni. And it continues into this until the most material covering of the body is described. In the role that the lungs and the liver play, we expanded somewhat on the lungs, but for the liver I said we would elaborate. In the Ayurvedic approach to the human body, there are certain differences from the current medical emphasis. The current medical emphasis is more on form and function, whereas the Ayurvedic approach is more on the quality and the gunas, the qualities of things, of energies. And in the Ayurvedic approach, the form and function are implied or are subsequent to the qualities. So when we look at the different organs of the body from a higher standpoint, each of the organs has a special function of energy, of life energy, and is executing that function. The heart, for example, is pushing out, spreading out into the whole body the energy, the substance, the nourishment, but it takes from everywhere and then pushes out the fresh nourishment, takes back and pushes out. And this is one function. The lungs become the intermediate vehicle of exchange of energy from our individual frame to the universal frame outside, the cosmos around. And they become that point of exchange of energy again. But a very narrow point of exchange, throwing out waste, taking in fresh energy. The stomach, though, and then the liver, they have a very special role. The stomach is still gathering the unprocessed, the insufficiently consistent, half-digested food. And in the intestines, there is the absorption by the body of what is necessary and a rejection of what is not. But after the absorption, we still have the digested food only. We do not have the material that the body needs. It is the material that has been taken in from the universe and has been processed to a point where it is now capable of being transmuted, transformed into what the body needs. That function is done by the liver. So in the biology as we see it today, there is a special vein which takes the material absorbed by the intestines and guides it straight to the liver. It's called, if I remember right, the portal vein. It brings it straight to the liver, and then the liver does the real work. It takes this now broken down raw material which came in from the universe and constructs out of it the substance of body. So in a sense, it is here that the real body substance is created. In the Ayurvedic perspective, the liver is seen literally as the organ of Agni, which creates the blood. So in the way it is worded, the rasa dhatu is turned into rakta dhatu. Literally translated, it would be the juice or essence, essential substance is turned into the blood substance, or rakta could simply be red. The name of the liver is even here it is used the same way, yakrut. Yakrut, that which does, which works, which acts. So literally it is that which creates, that which acts. It takes this raw material and turns it into the blood, which is your body substance. Blood, of course, is can be seen purely in terms of its literal fluid that moves, but when you see from the Ayurvedic perspective, it's the function of the blood. It carries all the nourishment, it carries all the life energy, all the raw material which is going to be spread across the whole body. It is literally body tissue in liquid form. That body tissue in liquid form is carried everywhere, and then, let's say, a part of the hands, for example, would take from the blood the body tissue in liquid form and arrange it as it needs as body tissue in solid form. But it has become body tissue, it has become living tissue. Until then, it was merely raw material taken from the universe. So this is the critical function of the liver. Of course, along with it, it does many other things. In Chinese medicine, again, the liver is given great importance, and it is seen as the great balancer and mediator between mind and body. And what is implied in all these descriptions is that as the liver puts out this body substance, it also balances so many rhythms. For example, in releasing glucose into the blood, it regulates the energy level. In releasing certain critical hormones in the blood, it regulates and balances the emotions, and it provides a filtration which purifies the blood and removes the waste. That's another critical function, that the red blood cells which have been damaged, which are now exhausted and broken, are taken by the liver, separated, and new cells are released. So it takes out the exhausted means of life spreading and regenerates them to bring new life. In terms of its function in the body, it is absolutely critical. You can do without a kidney, you can do without a gallbladder, but you can even do without one of the lungs, but you cannot do without this liver. And it is the only organ in the body which is capable of completely regenerating itself. If you cut out a part of it, it will rebuild itself and become complete. No other organ in the human body has this ability on its own. So you can see how it symbolizes this ability of life to regenerate itself, but also this transmutation and transformation of non-living substance taken in from the universe into tissue, living tissue of the body. So it is literally the seat of Agni, and you can see how it becomes such a critical player in the sequence here, where the undigested food from the stomach in the belly of the horse, taken up by the distribution system, passes through the liver and then through the lungs, where it absorbs the life force from the universe and then moves out to the rest of the body, where it becomes the most superficial substance of the tissue in the form of herbs and plants springing up out of the sap of earth and becoming the hair covering and clothing of the body of the horse. So the idea here is, we are seeing this material world and the form of the world, let's say the appearance of the plants from the earth. And what we see is the most superficial part of the cosmic horse. The real horse is all behind, and our physical sight sees only the most superficial thing. So this is now, with this I think we can complete this description and move on to the next portion, which is the description of the powers of the horse. Sri Aurobindo now says, some of these are material powers: the thunder, the lightning, the rain. He again quotes from the translation. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. There is a lightning. When he shakes himself, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. And now Sri Aurobindo is going to describe this. And in the immediate description, Sri Aurobindo focuses on certain symbols which are part of the yogic experience. He deals with it at a level which is at the level of consciousness, and later we will see also how these reflect on the other levels. So the word used in Sanskrit for when he stretches himself is vijrimbhate, extends himself by intensity. This is how Sri Aurobindo translates it. Vijrimbhate, extends himself by intensity. So the literal translation would be simply stretch. But Sri Aurobindo takes the Sanskrit etymology, extends himself by intensity. So there is a certain intensity in which the stretching and self-extension takes place. And this is going to be critical in the way we will understand it on all the different levels. Vijrimbhate, extends himself by intensity, makes the most of his physical bulk and force. So there is a certain bulk, there is a certain force, and it extends himself to make the most out of it. And you can see here, he is capturing a certain movement of consciousness. The second, vidhunnute, throws himself out by energy. This is the description of the horse shaking himself when it thunders. So, vidhunnute, throws himself out by energy, converts his whole body into a motion and force. So you see, the two things are very different. One is an extension, maximizing his energy, his bulk, his force with a certain intensity. The second is throwing out by energy, converting his whole body into a motion and force. These two words are of great impetuosity and vehemence in the Sanskrit, vijrimbhate and vidhunnute. These two words are of great impetuosity and vehemence, and taken in conjunction with the images, extremely significant. So in the image, it's something which you see as a physical process, lightning, thunder, and they are somehow associated, though we're not too sure exactly how. But we will see later how they are truly associated. The yogin will at once recognize the reference to the electrical manifestations, visible and felt, which accompany so often the increase of concentration, thought, and inner activity in this waking condition. Electricity, vidyutas, the material symbol, medium, and basis of all activities of knowledge. Sarvani vijnana vijrimbhitani, he quotes. He will recognize also the meghadhvani. Meghadhvani, megha is the cloud, dhvani sound. So literally translated as thunder, but the articulation is important. Meghadhvani, cloud sound. He will recognize also the meghadhvani, one of the characteristic sounds heard in the concentration of yoga, symbolic of kshatra tejas and physically indicative of force gathering itself for action. The first image is therefore an image of knowledge expressing itself in matter. The second is an image of power expressing itself in matter. So Sri Aurobindo has described this whole thing at the pure level of consciousness and as power of consciousness. We can already feel in the resonance of this description how it represents itself physically in the lightning and thunder. So knowledge expressing itself in matter and power expressing itself in matter. And knowledge and power, you will remember, Sri Aurobindo so often has described, they are twin aspects of Chit Shakti, consciousness force. In the very origin of creation, where there is the sheer existence, which is consciousness, which is bliss. The consciousness has twin powers of knowledge and power, and therefore it is Chit Shakti. When it is conscious, the awareness itself is the knowledge that it has of itself. It is aware and therefore it knows itself entirely, intimately, completely. But the knowing itself is a power of articulation, of expression, of highlighting anything that it knows itself to be and therefore manifesting. So the knowledge and power are as if simultaneously two facets of this consciousness force, but as it moves into manifestation, the two take on increasingly separate forms. So the knowledge becomes separate from the power, and the power takes a separate direction. And then in our human experience, the two are so completely split that you can have knowledge but no power, or you can have power but no knowledge. But as we return in consciousness upwards towards the unity, we find once again the two begin to merge into each other. As we ascend the levels of consciousness, the knowledge itself becomes a power of action. Power itself is knowledge dynamized, and the two merge to become a single, two-sided conscious force. Now, this is the experience, of course, in yoga, but we see how these two are deeply interconnected, and of course, they have a similar Vedic symbol, which we will perhaps refer to next time. But now, the two we see in their interconnection, and we're going to dwell on this as a meditation and look at it from several different facets as we go along. So, first we will see how in the human experience, we have these two experiences which belong to two different levels of consciousness. In the instinctive consciousness, we find knowledge and power bound together, but where the power, the imprint or the instinct of power comes first and the knowledge follows behind. And this is what we call instinctive drive. You feel something compelling you to do, to act, you move into action, but you don't know why. The knowledge is hidden behind. On the other hand, as we ascend in consciousness and there is the expression of intuition, we find first we know, we see, we know, and then the knowing can turn into an action. The power is there behind, but it is not explicit. And this is the distinction Sri Aurobindo makes between the instinct and the intuition in us. In a sense, it is instinct is intuition working at a lower level of consciousness, where the knowledge aspect is concealed. But as we rise, the knowledge aspect comes up in front again. And this is represented even in the movement of life energy. In the life force, when we look at instinctive life energy, that is the lower vital, we find the energy is always pushing to do something. It is described in the Veda as the smoky flame. It senses something, it even as if sees something, but its seeing is clouded by the smoke that it creates, the agitation and the confusion that is around it. And yet it pushes. So the light is covered up by the smoke, the action remains, and the knowledge is hidden behind. In the higher vital, on the other hand, we see a shift in the balance. The smoky flame now becomes a large fire. There is still smoke, but the smoke does not cover anymore. The light shines out, and the force of the action carries some degree of awareness, of knowledge. We come now to the domain of matter, and we see this pattern similarly, where we won't first look at lightning and thunder. We will look at generally the principle of electric expression, vidyutas. Where there is any concentration of energy or expansion, stretching out, extending, making the most of its bulk and force. Wherever there is this stretching, expansion, or compression, you will find the characteristics of electricity and of light. On the other hand, wherever it takes this form of pushing forward in throwing himself out by energy, converting the whole body into motion and force, you have the thunderous quality of energy, action, push. Now I'm going to first take a few very crude examples and then we'll go to something more subtle. In a crude example, in the car engine, in order for the car to move forward, the wheels have to be turned and the engine turns the wheels. But what happens inside the engine? There is the petrol which is dispersed in a fine powder, in a fine gaseous form, by spraying it in the air with fine droplets spreading out. But that's only so that it can burn easily. That in itself is not critical. The critical thing is it must be lit. There has to be a spark of fire. And the spark of fire immediately causes this, as it burns, to expand. The expansion is the burning, the fire in itself, not a force. It is just spreading out, lit up, bright. And this has to be channeled into a specific force in a specific direction. And this is what happens in the engine. As this expansion takes place, there is this very small vessel in which the expansion takes place. And as the expansion finds itself constricted, it is forced to move in the only direction possible, downwards, where there is the piston which is pushed and a single unidirectional force is pushed out. A series of such cylinders pushing creates the rotating movement by which the car moves. But you see these two things. There is the first expansion, and then there is the conversion of this into a force throwing itself out in a specific direction. And you have at that moment this electric spark which causes the flash of the explosion, the electric lightning, and then the explosion itself that follows, and the sound of explosion, the thunder. And the two are together in that sequence. Similarly, you will find in the, again a very mundane example, in dry air, if you take two objects, an object of, let's say, a silk cloth and plastic, and rub the two against each other, you will hear the crackling sound of static electricity. You take two pieces of cloth, touch them together and separate them, you will hear the crackling sound of static electricity. It happens even here, although we have very high humidity normally. On a dry day, you can hear sometimes, as you pick up two sheets of plastic and separate them, you will feel your hairs stand on end and you'll hear slight crackling sounds. And you see the same principle playing out. There is a stretching of something. And it is the stretching which creates the electric field. When the electric field becomes excessively stretched, it cannot contain itself, there is a spark. And with the spark there is a sound, a small burst, a small explosion. When the sparks are small, you hear a crackling sound, but each of these is actually a thunder, a small thunder. When you take a larger machine, Van de Graaff generator, which produces 500,000 volts or 1,000,000 volts, and then you'll see the flash of electricity, you hear much larger snapping explosions. Exactly the same thing happens in the air. When there is an expansion of the air stretches, sometimes caused by wind going against each other, two layers of wind rubbing against each other, or an updraft against a downdraft. Wherever there is an expansion of air and a stretching, a similar process takes place, and something is expanding which causes this intensification of electricity. until you see it flash, because the air cannot contain that intensity anymore. You see it flash, and that is the lightning. And with the flash comes the heating and the explosion, which is the thunder. Now, these two phenomena are so closely related that the moment you hear a thunder, you know that there was a lightning flash. And the two are almost simultaneous. If you see a lightning flash far away, you don't hear the thunder immediately, because the thunder takes time to come, because the sound goes slower than the light. If you count how long it takes from the flash to the point where you hear the thunder, you can actually calculate how far that lightning took place. Now, so far so good. This is what physics tells us. We see the connection, yes, it's obvious. But there's something else which we are finding more and more, which we don't understand. They explained that lightning takes place because of some buildup of electric charge from this movement of air. But there should be a gradual buildup of charge, because the lightning itself can have sometimes several million volts, huge amount of energy. But we do not find in all the experiments measuring electricity in the air, we do not find that kind of buildup of charge. Suddenly the lightning appears without any apparent buildup, and we don't understand why. But the second thing we see, and this is something very interesting, seen from space, this local lightning that we see here, let's say above Pondicherry, is not a single piece of lightning. Seen from space, there is a whole range, about 50 kilometers, sometimes up to 100 kilometers, where lightning seems to take place simultaneously. So if it is lightning above Pondicherry, for a range of about 50 kilometers all around, there will be local lightning at the same time. What produces such a large simultaneous flash of lightning? There is no physical mechanism that we are aware of at this point. Science fails here. It sees these gigantic sheets of lightning lighting up. The thunder itself may appear local from the local flashes, but there is a sheet of lightning extending over such a large area. The third thing we notice, again observing from space, before there is the lightning, there are streamers which form high above, extending out into space. Streamers of light which presage the big lightning that takes place in the clouds below. What is that? Why does it happen? We do not know. We actually do not know. It goes all the way into outer space. And finally, we notice that there are things which are like what are called sprites, bursts of energy which are seen into the clouds, which are also accompanying this whole phenomenon which we do not understand. So there's a whole dimension to lightning which we actually do not understand, which does not fit into conventional understanding of physics, but which is understood from an occult perspective differently. And I'm going to now play on that a little bit. Physics fails even to describe, even to understand, explain what is electricity. We describe electricity, but we do not explain it. When you see electricity moving in a wire, you do not see anything. You just see something happening as a result. The wire heats up, the wire gives you a shock. But what happened, what was transmitted, we do not see. We explain it by saying that there is a movement of electrons. But when we actually measure the electrons in an electric wire, let's say the generator is 1,000 miles away and the wire comes all the way to the city, you switch it on. The electrons flowing in the wire are moving at a speed of about 5 to 10 centimeters per second. It's very slow, like this. Observable. But the electricity, not the electrons, the electricity has gone at the speed of light, gone a few million miles in just a second. What went so fast in a fixed, physical, unmoving substance of metal, while the electrons themselves went so slowly? They were dragged along by the electricity? The answer today actually is we do not yet know. We hope to understand someday. We don't know what is electricity. But there's a deeper sense here which comes from the sequence in which we have been reading the whole text. And you will recall, just before, we have seen that in the description, the stars are his bones and the sky is the flesh of his body. And recall Sri Aurobindo's own explanation of this. The sky, Nabhas, the ether above us in which the stellar systems are placed. These stellar systems themselves, concentrations of ether, are the bones which support the flesh and of which life in this spatial infinity takes advantage in order more firmly to place and organize itself in matter. And this is where we get the clue. Sri Aurobindo explains that electricity is the most material expression of prana, pure life force. It is the only thing in the material domain which is pure force. It can transmit through metal wire with nothing moving. It is only force which has got transmitted to the other extreme in a moment. So it is the most physical expression of this pure force of life energy. And this life energy we have seen is intimately connected with the etheric substance, the etheric substratum. And it is this which we see in the suggestion here. Vijrumbhate extends himself by intensity, makes the most of his physical bulk and force. This very extension of this pure etheric substance, this flow, this expanse, this stretching out is the phenomenon of electricity. And you will find this reflects on all levels in the mind. When the mind concentrates or extends, stretches itself, any kind of compression or expansion creates this electric charge, even with physical results. And I'm going to give a few examples here. There are people who have unusual, what they call psychic abilities. Either it is clairvoyance or even powers of teleportation or the power of psychokinesis, moving objects, and they've been measured, observed in laboratories. And we're of course looking for some physical cause of their power. In one case, in several cases of this kind, but in one case which has been particularly described, there is a human person who is asked to concentrate, and in a state of concentration to see, as in a view across a distance. And the interesting thing was, the whole person was put in a laboratory cage to measure all of the parameters. They found on the body a sudden increase in electric charge, a voltage swinging up to 400 or 500 volts. And this is measured by sensors not even touching the body. The whole ambience around the aura has got a high voltage which rises the moment the concentration begins. Now, a variation to this, the person in concentration now brings the fingers together and an electric meter is put, a voltmeter, and you measure across the fingers an electric charge, again of a few thousand volts. Enough even to be able to create a spark. This happens the moment the person has concentrated, not trying to create electricity, but trying to see something or influence something. So the state of concentration itself, the gathering of consciousness, the extension or expanse of consciousness, which is the ether of consciousness, the chitta akasha, its extension, its compression creates an electric result, an electric effect. So this whole description has some very profound suggestions. Sri Aurobindo points to the yogic experience by saying, electrical manifestations visible or felt, which accompany so often the increase of concentration, thought, and inner activity in this waking condition. So wherever there's concentration, there's an increase of thought, there's an increase of inner activity, you'll have this electrical manifestation. visible or felt. So when it's visible, you see the spark, you see the light. When it's felt, you do not see the spark, but you will find when the electricity increases, the hairs on the body go up, or in the objects around, you will find a shift in their properties, and the air is charged, and so on. At the same time, immediately after comes the concentration of energy moving forward and the thunder. So you see, in the physical manifestation of this Vaidyutas, electricity, the material symbol, medium, and basis of all activities of knowledge. So in the physical manifestation of electricity, wherever the electricity is intensified, you will find light and heat. Take a wire, increase the amount of electricity, after a while the wire begins to glow. First light, and then as the glow increases, you have the heat. Exactly the same thing happens on all levels of consciousness. Wherever there is this concentration of consciousness, there is increase of light and increase of heat. Literally the meaning of tapas in yoga. So as the light increases, it is, depending on the level at which you are experiencing it, it is mental light or vital light or physical light coming from compression, concentration of mental substance, vital substance, or even physical substance. Along with the light, the heat. So the light in the mental world is the light of awareness, of knowledge. When you concentrate to know something, the very concentration produces the illumination in which the knowledge is revealed. When you concentrate your life energy, the very concentration produces the light and the heat, which produces a certain result. And the same in the physical. And where in the physical you find the heat and light suddenly, rapidly emerge, especially in a particular direction, you have the expansion from the heat, expansion of substance, the sound of thunder. Similar thing happens in the subtle domain, where there's an intense concentration, there is a sudden shift, a sudden breakthrough, which is equivalent to the thunder, the expression of power. In the life force, similarly, you put a certain energy and intensity, and then suddenly there's a breakthrough, the energy moves, there's a bursting out, something breaks, something moves, something changes. That's the equivalent of the thunder here. In actual yogic experience, when there is intense concentration, we often have a bright illumination, which is the equivalent of the lightning here, and sometimes accompanying it a sharp sound, a sharp explosion-like sound. Sometimes you will notice this happening when you are on the brink of falling asleep. Just as you're about to fall asleep, you hear a sharp burst, as if a cracker going out, pat, and you wake up from that, and you wonder what was it, and there was no physical sound, nothing fell. Sometimes you're conscious that the sound is as if an explosion inside your head. And often this represents the separation of the subtle body from the physical, a sudden movement, a sudden separation, or even a sudden transition between two worlds and through the barrier which separates two worlds. There also you have this sudden sound. So, he will recognize also the Megha Dhvani, one of the characteristic sounds heard in the concentration of yoga, symbolical of Kshatriya Tej and physically indicative of force gathering itself for action. Kshatriya Tejas, the energy, the intensity of the Kshatriya, of power to action. This is the reason why in many external symbols, when there is a gathering of power for a certain dramatic action, we use these sounds of thunder, or the roar, which are symbolic of the action now to be precipitated. You will see when a person rushes into war, he's shouting at the top of his voice. He's not screaming, he's not speaking words so much, it's just the roar of his voice. And it is this roar which is indicative of his energy directed to an action. And it happens spontaneously. We don't think of why we do it. The martial arts expert, when he goes to break stone or bricks or sheets of ice with a single blow, there is a shout, the kiai in Japanese. And if you ask him to do this same action without the shout, he will find it very difficult. Because at the time when he executes this action, all of his energy has first been gathered in concentration, the intensification of the Vaidyutas, and then released in a single direction as an outburst. And since his whole being is one-pointed in the gathering and released in a single movement, one-pointedly, all the parts of his being move into energetic expression, at which point the speech, which is one of the powers of expression, also moves into expression of energy, even as his hand or his leg and the whole body swing into the action. They often teach you in this way, that when you hit to break, it's not your hand which has to hit. It is your whole body which has to move. The hand is only an aspect, a part of the whole body. So it's as if the whole body moves into action and the hand is just the leading edge, and that breaks through. And not the hand, but the whole body movement, the whole energy. But again, it's not the whole body which moves as you're taught. The whole training at that point is to let go of the body consciousness and live in subtle body consciousness. And it is the subtle energy which moves, which carries the body and which carries the hand. And it's at that point that you have the maximum result. So the first, gathering in concentration, intensification of the energy, and then the release in this Meghadhvani, the release of the Kshatriya Tej, physical force gathered and released into action. So, with this background, we see now what Sri Aurobindo says, and then the third step which emerges from that, the rain. I think it's worth rereading this whole portion. Some of these are material powers, the thunder, the lightning, the rain. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes himself, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Vijrimbhate extends himself by intensity, makes the most of his physical bulk and force. Vidhunute throws himself out by energy, converts his whole body into a motion and force. These two words are of a great impetuosity and vehemence, and taken in conjunction with the images, extremely significant. The yogin will at once recognize the reference to the electrical manifestations, visible or felt, which accompany so often the increase of concentration, thought, and inner activity in this waking condition. Electricity, vidyutas, the material symbol, medium, and basis of all activities of knowledge. Sarvani vijnana vijrimbhitani. He will recognize also the Meghadhvani, one of the characteristic sounds heard in the concentration of yoga, symbolical of Kshatriya Tejas and the physically indicative of force gathering itself for action. The first image is therefore an image of knowledge expressing itself in matter. The second is an image of power expressing itself in matter. The third, the image of the rain, suggests that it is from the mere waste matter of his body that this great power is able to fertilize the world and produce sustenance for the myriad nations of his creatures. And then finally, speech verily is the voice of him. Vagevasya vak. Speech with its burden of definite thought is the neighing of this mighty horse of sacrifice. By that, this great power in matter expresses materially the uprush of his thought and yearning and emotion, the visible sparks of the great universal fire that is in him, Guha Hitam. So about the speech we will see more later, but for now simply this idea of the rain. The image of rain suggests that it is from the mere waste matter of his body that this great power is able to fertilize the world and produce sustenance for the myriad nations of his creatures. So literally the physical rain fertilizes the soil. But the rain itself is deeply connected with the lightning and the thunder. Physically first, we notice that the thunder is not possible without the lightning. But the rain itself never begins without first lightning and thunder. It's as if the lightning, in the expansion of energy, creates the thunder, but as an electrical manifestation triggers the joining of all the particles which are waiting to materialize as rain. Fine smoke, fine vapor, which now is forced to come together by the shaking up of the lightning and thunder. They join, they combine, become too heavy, and then fall. But something else happens. In the lightning, the nitrates are produced. The intense electrical reaction causes combinations of molecules to form, which are the nitrates which precisely fertilize the soil. And the rain brings those nitrates down. If not for the lightning, even if somehow rain was produced purely by condensation of cold, as you see often in a fog, which leaves behind a damp surface after its touch, it does not have the nourishing character which lightning introduces in it. And this is very important in the suggestion here, because Sri Aurobindo says it is from this waste matter that the power is able to fertilize the world and produce sustenance for the myriad nations of his creatures. So we see a clear connection in the sequence, physically, but in the symbol. The knowledge revealed, the power moved, there is then the materialization and the sustenance in matter by the knowledge and the power. Lightning reveals with its light. Thunder announces the action that is imminent, and then the action flows as the rain, which fertilizes and forms and nourishes all the worlds and the creatures in the worlds. So we'll look at the sense of the speech in the context of these three next time. And for now we can simply read this last portion and meditate on it. The strands are the food in his belly, the rivers are his veins, his liver and his lungs are the mountains, herbs and plants are his hairs. The rising is his front, and the setting his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him.